Good morning everyone and welcome to Bili Nursery. We'll wait a couple of minutes for some more people to arrive and then we'll get started. I'll be right back. Alright, now that a few of you have joined us, we'll get started on this. We've only got about 45 minutes to cover a huge topic today, so we're going to do our best. And if any of you run into any technical difficulties or want to contribute in any way, we've got our comments on, so feel free to slide in there and let us know what you're thinking. Before we get started, I just want to say too, this is a big topic. Before we get started, we just want to start with an acknowledgement to country. So we acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of the land of the Bunurong people, its elders past, present and emerging. And while we're here, I think it's important that we also acknowledge the other groups around Melbourne, so the Wurundjeri and the other clans, since many of us will be watching today from other locations. Before we really get into this, I also want to acknowledge that the Bunurong Foundation have been really supportive of us today. I am not an Indigenous man, but it's really important to note that the information that I'm sharing today is Indigenous knowledge. It goes back an extraordinary distance, and what I'm sharing with you today is here as an opportunity to share that information, but it's important that we all acknowledge and we always remember that this is the traditional knowledge and food of the nation of the Bunurong people. All right, before we kick into it, I'm just going to give you a little overview of where we are. So I'm Nick. This is Westgate Biodiversity, or Bili Nursery. You're watching me here from inside one of our propagating greenhouses, so I'll show you where we are. This is one of our cutting rooms where we grow Indigenous plants of the Sandbelt. So we as an organisation run the local Indigenous nursery called Bili Nursery. You'll also possibly know the park of Westgate Park, which is renowned on Instagram for its pink lake that goes pink most summers. So essentially we're a not-for-profit that grows plants that are found within 5 kilometres of Port Melbourne. And we produce most of the plants that you would see in things like council plantings, re-veg sites, and of course in our own park. The nursery started out as Skink, some of you would have known, at the back of St Kilda Adventure Playground nearly 30 years ago, at the same time as the park, and we merged together about 2.5 years ago so that we could basically bring all of our knowledge of Indigenous plants under one, overarching structure. If anyone has any questions on that, feel free to shoot through as well. Otherwise, I'm going to move on to talking about the scale of the agricultural systems that used to exist in this region before settlement. So where we're talking from today is essentially what we call the Sandbelt, and that's a section of Melbourne that extends basically from roughly Port Melbourne or Altona, and it extends all the way through to roughly Frankston, and it goes inland as far as basically Dandenong and Oakley in some areas. That's about as far inland as it gets. And it's typically found to have basically very poor quality sandy soil. Melbourne itself is actually covered by 3 different soil zones. We have the Sandbelt, where we're talking to you today from. There's also what we call the Gippsland Clay, which is essentially soil that was built from the volcanic eruptions that created the Strzelecki's and the Dandenongs back in the past. So that's the soil that's found in most of the sort of southeastern corridor of Melbourne. And it's usually got a little bit of a red content, and it's a very high quality soil. The rest of Melbourne is covered by what we call the Saltic Clay, which was formed basically when all of those huge volcanoes in relative recent times exploded over the western district of Victoria. So those are things that today we look at as things like Tower Hill, those large volcanic eruptions. That area is typified by basically very heavy soil that's got a lot of stone content and very heavy clay. So the plants we're looking at today and that we specialise in here at Westgate Biodiversity are the plants of the Sandbelt, but there's an enormous crossover between them. So often what we grow is found in other areas, but it's just that the plants are adapted to this very poor quality sandy soil that's quite different to the rest of Melbourne. So if anyone has any specific questions about how to change the propagation or cultivation that I talk about today in response to their local areas, feel free to jump into the comments as always, or send us an email. To get into what existed at the beginning of Melbourne. So Melbourne was basically a meeting site of these 3 soil zones, which makes our biodiversity and our plant life wonderfully diverse. What's notable is that when white settlement happened, they say that it took only about 3 or 4 years for all of the existing agriculture to be wiped out. It was systematically burnt, and it was also destroyed by sheep and cow cropping. Unfortunately, what that meant is that the entire food systems collapsed really, really rapidly, and they've never been rebuilt to a significant degree. I think it's really important that we work on that as a society, as part of NAIDOC Week and everything that we're talking about today. You can't really divorce food from its culture. So when you see a society who lost its entire food palette, if you will, you also are witnessing or seeing the effects of what happens when a society loses a big part of its culture. Their daily lives were built around foraging for food, hunting, all that sort of thing. And when they lost that ability to do that, that was a big part of the disempowerment that we saw. I think it's really important to note that everything we talk about today, these are fundamentally easy plants to grow. They're adapted to your local soils. They don't have particular issues with pests. We grow more than 300 species here in the nursery and we barely ever spray. This is a really great workplace, in part because as employees, we don't have a high chemical load because, quite simply, when the bugs turn up, it's very unlikely that they'll ever be fatal to any of these plants because they're adapted to work and live side by side. I think as we slowly take efforts to move these back into the suburbs and into these built-up areas, what it does is it not only rebuilds the ecology, the pollinators, the birds and the mammals, but it also presents an opportunity for Melbourne to bring back some of that cultural learning that's been, unfortunately, wiped out. I think that's probably enough talking about the history of that, and we'll go and now move on to some of our specific species that we're going to be covering off today. So we're going to start here. We've got a bit of a plan to work through today, so we're going to be spending 5 or 10 minutes talking about the main fruit species of Melbourne. In those I'll cover a few, but most notably some of our more popular ones at the appleberry, the Bilharderia, the native raspberry rubus and the Bubiala myoporum, one of which is right behind me just here. We'll be spending about 10 minutes talking about tea and cordial type species. So these are plants that you don't necessarily eat, but which have really interesting flavours and can be used as herbs and spices, or historically were used basically to flavour water. We're going to spend 10 minutes talking about the tubers and starches, and these are a really important area. So these are things like you might have heard of Murnong or Arthropodium. Both of those are particularly important because the research we've seen suggests that they made up more than 50% of the total calorie intake of that traditional diet. We're then going to spend another 10 minutes or so talking about the herbs and spices species. So we'll be talking about things like the native mint, the native thyme and oregano, wattle seed, samphire, some of the edible local succulents. And then at the end we're going to spend 5 minutes talking about the main seed and nut species. So in that we'll cover particularly Currajong and Acacia. And then at the end there's going to be some room for questions if anyone wants to shoot them through. So we'll hope to have this wrapped up in about 45 minutes. So I'm going to jump straight into our food species. So we're going to start with some of our indigenous fruits, and we're going to be talking about how you use them, what they taste like, and how to grow them and how to propagate them. So there's a fair bit to cover here today. So I'm going to jump straight in. I'm going to start today talking about this one here, which is appleberry. So we actually have 3 or 4 species across Victoria of appleberry. This is Bilharderia, I'll show you up close. There's no fruit on this one because it is a relatively young plant. The 2 most common species in Melbourne, the one that's found in the sandbelt is scandens. This is Bilharderia scandens. And there's also Bilharderia mutabilis, which is a little bit more of a messy grower with a smaller fruit. But they're very similar in how you grow them. So these plants are basically scrambling climbers. They exist under eucalyptus canopy and they scramble along the forest floor or alternatively up trees and shrubs and into the canopy. They produce a fruit that can be the size of sort of a small kiwi fruit. Unfortunately, this time of year I haven't got any I can show you, but they're an interesting flavour. So people give you different views of what the flavour would be, but to me I get strong hints of licorice. Some people get strong kiwi fruit or guava kind of tones out of them. The other thing is, of course, the age of the fruit varies. So the Bilharderia are really useful because if you like them as sort of a dessert fruit, you eat them when they're a little bit soft and as they drop off the plant. Alternatively, you can actually pick the berries when they're much smaller and green, and then they were traditionally roasted and used basically like a roasted potato type vegetable. My personal preference is the little green ones. I don't particularly like licorice, so I'm not a big fan. As for growing this plant, it's a very, very easy plant. This one basically needs to be given enough room to get quite large, so they'll scramble up and over other hedges. So if you put them in competition with anything fragile, you'll be sure that it's going to kill it off eventually. We like them up fences or even over archways. They've got a very pretty little bell-shaped yellow to sort of white-coloured flower, and the fruit hang quite large as well. Propagation-wise, they're fairly hard to grow from seed, so we usually recommend if you're going to propagate them, you do it from cutting. And my tip to you is that you basically want to use your soft tips. So all these woody parts of the stem prove a little bit less willing than the top. And this is the time of year right now, roughly, where you would do that. You can propagate into water, or you can do it into basically soil that you keep permanently moist. I'm going to quickly move on so we don't lose too much time, because we've got a lot of plants to cover here. I'm going to show you one of our other most common plants that you see all over the city of Port Phillip, and indeed all along the coast in Melbourne, but also there are a couple of very, very similar looking species that are inland. So this is what we call Coprobrodus, or salt plum. Coprobrodus is a really cool plant because the whole thing is edible. So the leaves, admittedly, they have very little nutritional value, but there's no poison in them or anything like that, and there are stories in the early days of lost convicts surviving virtually off this, mixed with seaweed and fish. And it also has a really bright, pretty flower, and then a little berry that sort of forms afterwards. So the berry sort of forms off the main stem. It's sort of roughly an inch long. You'll know it's ready to pick by the smell. So the best thing to do is to get in close, have a whiff, and it has a strong, sweet scent when it's ready to go. The flavour is really unusual. They call it a salt plum for a good reason. It basically starts out with a sort of berry or plum kind of flavour, but then it leaves you with an aftertaste that's a strongly salty umami kind of flavour. So it's a really interesting one if you want to jazz up a dish with something that's got a really unusual flavour combination. And the beauty of it is they're absolutely everywhere, and they're one of the easiest plants that you're going to grow here today. Propagating wise, they are literally as simple as breaking a piece off and popping it in the ground. And for Dara there, this was Coprobrodus, or pig face. Just to give you all a little bit of a warning too, there are, unfortunately, some South African species of Coprobrodus that have been planted around Melbourne. And they're hybridising in and basically wiping out our original species. So if you're going to grow them, make an effort to come down to an Indigenous nursery, and I am making a plug, to make sure you're getting stock that is the original Melbourne species. I'm going to move on quickly, because time is of the essence. Here we have Bubiala. So this plant gets a few names as common names. This is Bubiala insulare, or sometimes known as the Australian juniper. This plant grows, I've got one right behind me here, so I'll show you this as well. This plant grows into a decent sized shrub. So you usually find these in the primary dune system of the coast or along creek lines. It likes to be associated with water, even though it's actually very drought tolerant. It's a really good hedging plant if you want a bit of a privacy hedge. I think that it makes a really good alternative if you want an Indigenous food plant for the ficus splash that a lot of people are planting around Melbourne these days. Just pop that back. The plant itself is a very easy grower. It tolerates sun, it tolerates basically high salt loads, it can tolerate flooding, so it's a really great plant for that kind of job. The berries themselves start out as tiny little green berries, and they're very bitter when they're young. As they age, some plants will turn to a yellow, others will turn to a sort of red, and the berry's only about probably 1 centimetre to 2 centimetres across. The flavour on it gets stronger as the berry ages, so when they're sort of just starting to turn is when I like them best, and to me, I get a really strong reminiscence of like one of those eucalyptus lollies we would have eaten as children. As they get older, the flavour gets more intense, and breweries around Melbourne have started to use it in the flavouring of gin, which is a really exciting thing. It tastes delicious if you're a gin drinker like I am. But if you're going to eat the berries as they get red, they are quite strong. So my advice would be probably use them as a mix through a dessert or something like that instead. Propagating wise, these plants can be grown from seed, although they are difficult. So the seed is inside the little berry. The problem is that this is one of many local plants that has to pass through a bird, as in be ingested and come out the other side before it will germinate. So if you're going to grow them from seed, you are going to have a very low success rate unless they happen to have come through a bird on the way. What we do instead is we grow them from cuttings. So to show you quickly, this is a cutting grown plant as well. So you can see that what we've taken is a nice sizable sort of 6-inch long piece of fresh growth, and it's been grown in water until it has taken. And you can see that it's taken because it's put on new growth and it has roots coming out the bottom of our tubes. As I say, I think this is one of those plants that should be more popular in Melbourne because it looks a lot like some of our common landscaping plants, but it has all those multiple uses as well as habitat value. I'm going to move on from our fruit for a minute, although let me just quickly touch, it's just come through as a comment, let me just quickly touch on the Myoporum. There are actually a few Myoporums in Melbourne and they look pretty similar, but it's important that you get the right one. And this is something that we have to sort of touch on, which is if you are going to go out and forage bush foods, make sure that you don't do it in an area where plants are going to be basically decimated and unable to reproduce by doing it. Make sure likewise that you have permission from wherever you're collecting them. You know, we don't want to see a situation where all of Melbourne starts taking all of this bush food out of the systems, because it ends up a bit of a self-defeating process. To get back to what I was saying, there are some similar looking Myoporums in Victoria. So here's a different one, for example, which you can see has a red stem. There's also a ground cover one. Some of them have low doses of toxins in them. So it's really important when you're doing this sort of stuff that if you're in doubt, don't eat it. That's always the rule. And we never really encourage anybody to go out and forage. You're really better off making sure that you've got correctly ID'd plants. And the best way to do that is to grow them in your own garden. If you are going to use the other Bubialas, basically, you've got to make sure that you don't eat too much. So it's really that simple. I'll just pop that out of the way for us. And to respond to you there, Matt, that was Myoporum insulare. We're going to move on now to talking about some of our tea and cordial type species. So I've got a few of them to cover here and I'll try to be relatively quick with them. So I'm going to start off with what is one of our most common local plants. It's also the emblem of our company. This is Coria Alba. So you'd probably know this plant. It grows all along the foreshores, likewise along the creek lines, and it's a really tough coastal hedging plant. What you wouldn't know is it's increasingly used for topiary. So a lot of those sort of bald plants that you see in very formal gardens are in fact this native bush food. The part that you actually eat on one of these is these fresh tips. So you can see that the plant, this is a young plant, but you can see that this plant has nice fresh tips. If you were going to eat it, basically what you would do is take off the tip, and you only want these bits that have got this nice springy kind of growth. If I show you on the rest of that branch, you can see that it's not got that kind of flick back. It would snap if I were to push it too far. You're best off to dry this before using it as a tea. The flavour seems to improve and you end up with a more sort of nuanced and interesting flavour. You can, however, do it straight like that. So if you want to, you can basically just put that straight into really hot water and brew it up. The result is sort of what I would describe as a chai with a hint of bergamot. So it's got like nice sort of peppery, cinnamony tones and then sort of a bergamot aftertaste. This was a really popular plant in the early days of Australia when tea was basically prohibitively expensive and they had to find alternatives to it. I really like Coria too because it's an amazing plant for bird life as well. So if you're interested in having a garden that's going to both contribute to the ecology of our sort of inner urban areas where we've, let's face it, built on top of what would have once been, you know, very diverse areas, but also have food plants, this is another of those that really you can't go wrong with. It grows in full sun, full shade, heat, sun, it doesn't really mind. It's a very, very tough plant. So that's sort of the piece that you would use. Propagating wise, this one's a little bit difficult. So the best way to do it is to get the seed when you can, and it germinates fairly readily, but it's hard to collect. The other way is basically to create cuttings, and the way you do that is you do small pieces like those, and you can do them in water or in soil, but they do have a low success rate. So it's one of those that is a little bit difficult for the home gardener, but worth a try if you're interested. I'm going to show you next some of our most popular cordial type plants. So these were plants that historically were used to flavour water. Unfortunately, because of the time of year, it's the flowers that are primarily used and we haven't got many. So I'm going to show you the plants and you're going to have to use your imaginations to dream up what they actually look like. The first, and my personal favourite of all of these local plants, is the local callistemon. So this is the local Melbourne bottle brush. It's called Callistemon cybrii. Callistemons, the local form, can be identified because it's not got a big red flower like some of the WA and New South Wales species. It's got a fairly small yellow flower, sometimes with hints of pink or red through them. Occasionally you get a really pretty one that has sort of a sunset kind of a flower. And basically what you do, that's the plant there, basically what you do with them is you take the flowers and put them in the water, and they basically release all of their nectar, which is their for their pollinators, which are birds primarily. They release all of that nectar as a sugar and a flavour into the water. After a couple of hours, if you drink it down, it's really, really delicious. It's interesting that the age of the flower has some impact. So you want to sort of get good at this. You want to sort of pick the flowers that are at that time when they're releasing the bulk of their nectar. So a really old flower will give you very little, and a very young flower will give you fairly small amounts as well. So you want to wait until the flower is fully open but not aged. And the other trick is pick it before it gets hot in the middle of the day. I'm going to show you again another of our local plants used in the same way. So this is the local Banksia Integrafolia. I've got a bigger one here that I'll show you as well. So we have a couple of local Banksias around. This is Integrafolia, which I'm showing you here. You can tell what it is because it's a big sort of saw-shaped leaf with a very nice silver underside. There's also another called Banksia Margina. They look very similar, Margina being basically much smaller. Both of these have large cone-shaped flowers like the Banksias of WA or New South Wales. And what you do with those, again, is you pick off the flower, pop it in water. You can leave it even overnight if you want to. I would recommend filtering it if you're going to use this particular species because it tends to leave a bit of its flower behind. But they basically, what they do is they release all of their nectar, which is intended for birds to drink, and the water ends up a really pleasant flavour. So it's a really nice way if you want to do sort of a summer drink or if you want to later brew it into tea, and it ends up quite delicious. To cover one more of our local sort of tea plants, this right here is Melaleuca Squarosa. We have a couple of local tea trees, and the tea trees are worth mentioning. They have a couple of uses. So tea trees, the leaves you can brew into tea, and each species tastes differently. My tip is some of them aren't particularly pleasant to my taste. So if you're going to do it, play around and see which ones you like best. In my view, the best one of the lot is Labigatum, which is basically the weediest of all of them as well, which is quite nice. These are super tough plants. They basically grow in swampy areas that would have existed, for example, all over Elwood would have been covered in this sort of stuff. Squarosa is the biggest of all of them. It's a paper bark, so if you live in the northern suburbs, you might know it as a street tree. It's commonly planted around there. And it has a very pleasant little white flower that comes on, sort of probably 1.5 inches long. And around about now is when they're flowering. This one, however, is a little bit young to be doing that for us. This is possibly, to most people, the best of the flavours of all of these. So what you do again is you pick off the flower when it forms as it's at its most ripe, and ideally I would recommend doing it first thing in the morning before the heat of the day. And if you leave that in water from anywhere from sort of 2 to 24 hours, you end up with a really delicious, sort of gently flavoured, kind of eucalyptus sweet sort of tasting drink. That can then be brewed into a tea if you prefer to do it that way, or alternatively drunk cold. And it was used traditionally in that same way. So where they had water that was not necessarily the best flavoured, they used this as a way of essentially adding sugar and flavour into that water, along with a lot of their other early plants. So that covers off our tea species. If anyone has any questions, just throw them down into there. I'm going to move on now to talk about what is probably the most important of the bush foods, and those are our starches and our tubers. So to give you all a bit of a background, there are early paintings of Melbourne, and in those paintings you see that they're essentially eucalyptus forests, quite open canopies, and underneath it's a sea of yellow. Now that sea of yellow represents what was once the dominant agriculture in the area. To respond to you, the tea tree that we just talked about was Melaleuca Squarosa. So that's the Melbourne paper bark. Going back to my Murnong. Murnong basically covered most of Melbourne. These are the two species that we commonly find. There are 3 species currently recognised across the Melbourne region. There is talk there might be soon quite a lot more of them, as we do a lot more genetic studies into this sort of thing. Basically what was done with these is in the late autumn period, Bunurong and other groups would move around and they would turn the soil over and scatter the seed of these species through it. So you ended up with these large eucalyptus forests that were actually covered in these small little daisy plants like these. So you can see the size of these against my hand. They're not a massive plant. The most important thing is that you can eat the leaves, although to be honest with you, they're not very tasty, but they produce a little edible tuber. And those little edible tubers were possibly the most important food plant that we had in Melbourne. So the research says that between these and one of the water plants that unfortunately we won't be discussing today, they probably made up roughly 50 to 80% of the total calories that were actually taken in during those periods. Unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, within about 4 years of the arrival of European-style agriculture, sheep had eaten these completely out of existence. The only places where they were left were essentially places that sheep couldn't get to. So, populations of them are still found in places like the Yuyangs and in the top of the Organ Pipes National Park, and in some of the areas around the Yarra Valley, which are really steep, where sheep never really got. But these once almost carpeted our entire area, and unfortunately there's almost none left. Now the difficulty about them is, as you can see if I show you up close, they look to a lot of people a lot like a dandelion. So unfortunately, well-meaning gardeners sometimes spray them thinking that they are a dandelion, but they are a really important, probably the most important of all our bush foods. I've got a couple of tubers here that I dug up earlier to show you, representing a couple of different species. So just give me a moment and I'll grab those for you. So these are quite young tubers. These plants get quite a lot larger. These are only about 3 months old, and you usually wouldn't eat them until they were about a year old. So these are the little starchy tubers that they form. The end result would be about that long and sort of an inch wide. So they're not massive plants. We often joke with people that if you're growing Murnong, you don't measure it in individual plants, you measure it in square metres. But they are really easy to grow. They're very fast growing. They don't seem to mind a pretty broad range of soil conditions. A lot of our customers have been reporting to us that they find they grow incredibly well in vegetable patches, so they're not a native that needs sort of native fertiliser or anything like that, and they do seem to enjoy a little bit of compost worked through. The actual fruit, as you can see there, or not fruit, sorry, the tuber, is basically a very starchy tuber. So if I break it open and show you, it's got a white centre. You can eat them raw, so I'll show you that. Their flavour is somewhere between, a carrot and a water chestnut. But traditionally they were roasted. Now, when I eat these, my favourite way to prepare them is pretty simple. Basically, take the little tubers, usually bigger than that, and fry them up with garlic. And you end up with something that's pretty similar to a roast potato in its texture and in its content. So these little tubers were probably the most important food, and they were foraged extensively and grown all over Melbourne. It's another case of that sort of early agriculture that we, as white settlement happened, was invisible because it didn't have square boundaries and it didn't have fences, but it was a really important part of that culture that was wiped out really rapidly. So there's some great projects across Melbourne if you want to get involved that are sort of returning Murnong to some of their traditional areas. And we've seen a massive increase in interest in these little guys, which is, I think, a wonderful thing. They're also a great habitat plant. There's unfortunately no flowers here for me to show you today. But they've got a very bright little yellow flower that we've found like native bees and pollinators really love as well. As I mentioned, propagating them, the best way is from seed. So all you've really got to do is wait for your plant, this one is about 3 months old, to grow its seed head. Once it does, you can basically fold that through a rich soil, and they grow pretty easily from seed. So it's one of those things where if you wanted to do a patch of them, it's not hard. I've got 2 species here, so just to show you, this is Lanceolata, which was probably the most common one in Melbourne. And this is Scapaguera, which was found only really in the colder, higher country, so would have been found sort of in the top of the Yarra Valley and that kind of area. If you are going to grow this Alpine form, my tip to you is the seed needs to be kept in a fridge or a freezer for a few weeks before sowing. So it needs to believe that it's gone through a long frost period. Which is a little inside tip for those of you who might be having difficulty with germinating that seed. The other species don't seem to care one way or another what you do with their seed. I'm going to move on now from Murnong and talk about some of our lilies. So these are some of my personal favourites because they're so damn pretty. So just to show you, hopefully you guys can all see this, these are the flowers of our vanilla lily. These are an arthropodium. There are 2 main species of arthropodium that were eaten most prominently across Melbourne. There are plenty more plants in this category, but these are sort of the most important. They are vanilla and chocolate lilies, Arthropodium milleflorum and strictum. And I'll, just get that out of your way. These plants, if I show you, they have big, large, fleshy root systems. So if I show you up close, you can see these tubers that form. So I'll pull one of them out just to show you. Now these, again, this is a young plant again, so just to show you, that's the little tuber that I've pulled off that one plant. So these little tubers, again, similar to Murnong, they grow much larger than these baby plants I've got here today. They will end up forming sort of long sort of sausage shapes, sort of up to about 6 inches long and a couple of inches wide. They've got a really interesting texture, similar to the Murnong in the sense they've got that sort of water chestnut snappiness to them. Again, you can snack on them raw. I don't think they're really worth doing raw, but you can. They've got a pleasant sweetness to them that really does remind me of a good potato. But sort of with that water chestnutty, sort of moisture-rich, cracking kind of texture. The best way to eat these little guys, essentially, well, for one thing, is make sure they're a bit bigger than what I just picked. But basically, again, is to roast them. So traditionally, these are all roasted in open fires and eaten basically with meats and herbs and spices. So, you know, if you were to do a veggie patch, for example, of your arthropodium with these beautiful purple and white flowers, and your Murnong with their gold, you'd end up with this beautiful little piece of ecology that would be great for the local bees and the birds. It would feed you. So these are examples of ways we can really restore some of our urban ecology in a way, you know, that's quite easy and also quite nutritious. Propagating wise, to talk you through these two species of arthropodium, both of them can be found basically in dappled shade. So you can see they're a nice little lily plant. For scale against my hand, they're not particularly large, though they do get bigger than that. They'll probably get to about twice that size. The flowers themselves sit up about 1.5 meters at most tall. And they get these very pleasant sprays. So these are very large and showy flowers with a really beautiful, strong vanilla perfume. The other species is really interesting because it has a perfume that's strongly, strongly chocolate. And both species have those edible roots. They're just slightly different shapes, but you treat them much the same. Growth-wise, you can plant them in semi-sun, semi-shade. They're pretty happy with a fairly broad range of conditions. They're not particularly fussy about soil, but we do find if you're growing them for food, your best bet is to make sure you fold a little bit of compost through to make sure that they've got enough nutrition for these large tubers, as I showed you, that form. These plants, if you leave them over multiple years, you can end up lifting them and taking a few tubers each time. So the good thing about these compared to the Murnong is that unlike the Murnong, you don't have to kill the plant in order to eat it. Which is nice because it's a bit heartbreaking to kill something that's pretty. Alright, there are a bunch of other sort of starches and tubers that we should mention. So a lot of the native orchids were traditionally eaten, the bindweed and a few others, but we're not going to talk about them today because they're quite rare. And we don't want anybody going out there and stripping off rare plants for the sake of a few bites to eat. So I'd encourage anyone who's going to do this to come into your local Indigenous nursery or track down some seed and get your own plants so that we can leave our ecology sort of as it has been. Now, in the interest of time, I'm going to move on again. So we've got about another 10 minutes to talk about some of our herbs and spices. So I'm going to move quickly onto those. Just give me a moment. So I'm going to start with our saltbush. So saltbush, there are a few species across Melbourne and nearly all of them are edible, but the best one of the batch is a Triplex Cinereal, which is that one there. You find that growing along the foreshore nearly all the way along Melbourne. We're really lucky in Melbourne because this is one of those plants that was deliberately removed in the early days in order to basically starve people out. And so what they did is they stripped it off, and in large parts of South Australia, for example, it's almost extinct. But we're really lucky that in Melbourne, along our foreshores, it's been being replanted by councils for decades now, and it's quite prevalent. The part that you eat on this plant is you basically take the soft tip. So to show you, that's the sort of soft tip. You can eat it raw, and it's quite tasty. This is basically a very high protein vegetable when you eat it like this, or you can dry it and use it as a herb. So it's got an interesting flavour. To me, it reminds me a lot of a salty sort of celery kind of texture. With a little bit of an umami aftertaste like many of our coastal dune plants have. You can see these little leaves. They're quite fleshy, quite good. People love them in omelettes, for example, and as a cure for lamb. Look, they go really well in soups and that sort of thing as well. The plant itself is one of the easiest to grow that you could ever come across. If you want to give a triplex a go, I'd say anyone should, because the only thing that seems to be able to kill our triplex is too much water. This one here is a Triplex Cinereal, or the old man's saltbush. As I mentioned, there are many saltbushes across Melbourne, but this is the tastiest of the lot. And the reason that it's the tastiest is that the growth is really nice and fresh and fleshy. So you get a good moisture content, and it forms quite a nice vegetable in that area. Moving on from that, I'm going to talk about a couple others. So I've got here the Australian river mint. So this is Menthol Australis. This is basically, was once found all along the river channels and the creek lines along Melbourne, anywhere where there was sort of standing water and not too much flow. So the smell of it, it's basically a better peppermint. This one's beautiful. You can use it in any way you would use peppermint. And growth-wise, it's exactly the same too. I've got a little plant here, so you can hopefully all see that. And you can see how this plant is progressively making its way out of its pot and trying to take over the whole nursery. That's a very normal thing for mint. So one of the tips that we always tell people is that if you're going to grow mint, grow it in a pot. Because if you don't, you soon won't have much else. And it does need to be kept quite wet. So because it's a bog plant, you basically got to keep it in permanently wet situations. So a lot of our customers, they basically take these and they plant them around garden taps, which is a nice way to do it. The other great thing about this plant is it does work as an indoor plant. Likewise, it also can be done in really, really shady environments. So because it was basically found in wetland bogs, it's fairly easy to grow. Just give me 1 minute. Just turning off our irrigation behind me there. To move on to the next thing, I'm going to talk next about some of the Alpine mint bushes. So these are your Prostanthera. This one here is incisor, known as native thyme. There are a few different species of these that were eaten. They were all found not so much within the city of Port Phillip, but they were found in the high country, sort of up in the Yarra Valley and around Toolangi. But they were dried and traded all over Victoria. So these little fresh tips, if I show you up close, these little fresh tips, you can basically use them fresh, or you can dry them off and turn them into a herb. The flavour of this one is sort of somewhere between a sort of savoury mint flavour and a thyme kind of basil kind of flavour. So it's an interesting kind of crossover. And we love these plants because they're almost specialists for dry shade. So those awkward little spaces down the sides of houses where nothing will really grow, often this is the right plant for the job. It turns into a sort of small bush. I've got one just behind me here. Very nice bright green kind of colour. And they get covered in beautiful little mauve flowers. We like them too for those side of house situations because when you walk past them and brush against them, they release that perfume. And so they make you and your whole house smell like sort of Alpine thyme or a native mint. One trick with those though is they do have a little bit of a bitter aftertaste. So if you're going to use them in desserts, I'd recommend that you cut them with a little bit of sugar so that you can eliminate that from your cooking. To move on to one of our next, this is one of our local Indigenous salt marsh plants. So Port Phillip was once covered in shallow salt lakes that were unfortunately removed in the early days when we drained the whole area. Now the salt lakes had a really interesting ecological and human niche, which was that they didn't support a lot of life, but it was a really unique area biodiversity wise, and there isn't much of it left. There is a little bit at Westgate Park, the park that we manage, but virtually all of it besides over in Altona and a little bit down in Geelong is all gone. But it was once covered in Australia's or Victoria's little local succulents. So I like this plant because you can grow it as an indoor plant really well, and unlike other succulents, it quite likes being kept wet. So it's one of those plants, if you're a person who grows indoor plants but you overwater everything to death, I reckon you should give this a try as a little kitchen herb. Now the actual part of the plant that you eat of the samphire are these little fresh growths, so you can snap them off. And there's the little growth. And they've basically got a really good textural crunch. So I love them as a salad addition for the fact they've got this interesting crunch. They've got a really nice sort of gentle salty flavour. Reminds me a little bit of like a salty aloe vera, which sort of makes sense when you look at what they look like. And the other thing that's commonly done with these is they're used in preserves. So any of you who are watching who might come from a Mediterranean background would know that in Europe, samphires are used, basically they're preserved with garlic and olives and all kinds of delicious things. And it's the same thing here. So you can essentially use these and turn them into like a sauerkraut type situation, which is another way to eat them with a total change to their texture as well. Propagation-wise, like any succulent, these are really easy. You literally break a piece off, keep it nice and wet for a little while and it grows roots. Usually takes anywhere from sort of 5 to 20 weeks, depending on the time of year, and how good you are with your watering. I'm going to show you here as well one of our other local grains. So this is the native linseed, the Flax Lily. I'll try to get those flowers to sit still for you. So these have a really, I hope you can all see that, a really pleasant little blue flower. And they grow essentially the same as a European linseed. The difference is these linseeds don't live for 1 year. They last for anywhere sort of up beyond 5 to 10 years. They form nice, big, dense clumps covered in these pretty little blue flowers and then a linseed. The difference with the linseed as well is that instead of being that dark colour, they're usually bright yellow. So if you want something that's a little bit different, very, very easy to grow and very nutritious, these native linseed are an interesting little addition that, again, would have once been really common across Port Phillip and across the sandbelt because they're one of the most tolerant plants to really bad salty soil that's very, very dry and not much will grow in. These seem to do very, very well. They're a very pretty, fine plant, a nice little blue flower as well, really good for the native bees. And as I say, they produce a really nice edible linseed. It's basically a bright yellow, slightly smaller than normal linseed, which is a nice little addition as well. I'm going to jump over to our wattle seed. So Melbourne has a whole lot of different species of wattle. There are 14 that we grow in our nursery here that are found in the city of Port Phillip, and there's a few that are on the edge of that as well. The important thing to note is that all the wattles in Victoria are edible, as in their seed. But not all of them necessarily produce significant amounts of it, and they all vary in their flavour. So the best two, as far as we're concerned, would be this one here, which is your blackwood, Acacia melanoxylon. And then there's also Acacia sopherae, which is the coast wattle. I haven't got any of those here to show you, but you could look those up. And the two of those are probably the best performing as far as the seed is concerned. This one forms large forest trees. In Port Phillip, you usually find it as a multi-stemmed plant along the creek lines. There is quite a few nice plants, for example, along Alwood Canal. Sorry, excuse me, I'm just going to grab a drink. And Acacia Longafolia, sorry everybody, Acacia Longafolia is found basically in the primary dune system behind the beaches. Both of them, the trick is to get the seed, and the seed's usually ready around Christmas time. And you can basically dry that seed, roast it at a low temperature, usually, I find just over 100 degrees, and for a very short while we'll get it roasted. You can then either grind it up or eat it whole. They've got a really nice nutty but kind of chocolatey flavour. Although you do find the different species vary a little bit. So if you try it and you don't like it, I'd recommend go and try a different one. Because everyone has their own flavours that they most appreciate. There are, across Australia, you would know, or you may know, that acacia is the second most prevalent species behind eucalyptus. So the family of the acacias covers large areas of Australia. And there's only a couple of species in the whole continent that are actually poisonous to humans. The rest of them are quite useful bush foods. But as we always say, if you're not sure, don't eat it. And we really do recommend that rather than foraging from the wild, where you could get it wrong, that you get your own plants and leave the wild seed to do what it should do, which is make more wild plants. I'm going to move on now, because time is getting away from us, as always, to talking about some of the native seeds and nuts. So we're going to jump into talking about some of our couragons. These are the Brachychyton. These are the closest relative to the Australian bottle trees. So here we have a young Brachychyton populnaeus. This is the most useful form. And behind me, if I show you as well, we also have one that's a very common street tree in Melbourne. This is the flame tree, Brachychyton acerifolius. Both of these produce really pretty flowers, sort of nowish. And then after that, they have large seed pods that develop that are full of little seeds. I've got some seeds here that I'm going to show you from our seed stash. Just give me a moment. Now, it's going to be difficult for some of you to see this, but I'll do my best. These little yellow seeds that look like little corn kernels, if I show you, I hope you can all see that. They basically taste somewhere between a peanut and a popcorn. They have an extremely high protein content. We're talking 25 to 30% depending on the plant. So they're actually a really nutritious, fabulous food. So you can see this one here is off acerifolius. That's the Australian flame tree, which I should point out is not indigenous, but it's a street tree all over Port Phillip and Melbourne. It is one of the species that they're planning to replace all of our plane trees with now that we're all getting allergy reactions. So they're going to be very common across Melbourne, and these little seeds are really nutritious. You can eat them raw, but they're quite fibrous if you eat them raw. They're best basically roasted. So the best way to go is to do them at a low temperature, anywhere under about 120 degrees for a short while. I find literally only about 8 minutes in my oven. And in response to you, Captain Sustainability, these are the Brachychyton, the Currajongs. So the two species we're talking about are the true Currajong, the white-flowered one, and the flame tree, which is behind me here with the big sort of maple-shaped leaf. Once you've roasted these, they can be eaten whole, or you can crush them up and turn them into a flour. So traditionally, these were usually crushed up and turned into damper. I quite like them as a whole piece. You can pop them in things like salads as a bit of a crunchy element, use them as you would a nut. And as I say, they're super high in protein. So they're one of the most nutritious plants that you can grow, and they're really, really easy. These plants turn into large, large trees, so you've got to have room in the garden for them if you're going to do it. But we're having a lot of success doing them as indoor plants. So, and in response, the same does go for Rupestris. The only thing is that in Melbourne, it's very unlikely that you'll ever get seed off Rupestris. It's very, very rare that it's ever hot enough for Rupestris to basically go to seed. So you're better off with one of these species that will actually flower and produce you and send you seed. But Rupestris is worth having in its own respect as a very cool novelty. The other thing with your Brachychyton, I'm going to pull this plant apart, so don't be alarmed, is that they have an edible root. So just give me a moment, I'm going to rip this plant out. So you can see there what looks sort of like a carrot. And this plant would be exactly 12 months old, and that root would have been traditionally eaten at that point. So these plants were basically traded around Australia. The seed could move long distances very easily. And the baby plants were grown under the adults traditionally, because they like shade when they're young. And the seed was either eaten or it was grown to produce these. So these behave very much like a carrot. You can snap them very easily. They're full of water. So in periods of drought, the other thing that was done is the adult plants were even dug up, and these big tuberous roots were found, and you can actually press them very hard, and they actually ooze out a really edible liquid. I'll tell you, it doesn't taste particularly good, so if you're going to do it, find yourself one of your cordial plants. But in periods of drought, it was one of the ways that our Indigenous community were able to survive in areas where there wasn't running water. So that's the little tuberous root there. You can imagine if you had a good garden of these sorts of plants, you could have things like your little tiny murnongs once they're a bit bigger, and your arthropodium that I showed you earlier, plus your Currajong, and you essentially have what's equivalent to potato and carrots. And they're very, very edible. You obviously wouldn't want to eat this without washing off the soil first, and in an ideal world, these things would be a continuous straight stem. They can get a little larger than that, but as the plant gets older, the stem inside here gets woodier. So you've got to find the right sort of area or the right age to pick these plants off. And my tip to you is at about 12 months of age. So you can see this plant's sort of against me, it's about a foot tall. That's probably when they're at their best, where you've got heaps and heaps of root growth, so it's not too small, but it's not so old that it starts to get woody and hard to chew on, if I can put it like that. Now, I mentioned earlier to some of you that as an indoor plant, these work really well. So you can see how I've literally ripped that roughly out of its pot to show you the root. If you want to do this as an indoor, we have a little trick that we sometimes do. I'm going to show you this really quickly. I'm going to pop this back in its pot just roughly for you, and press it in, and show you the most ridiculous thing we do with these. You can see that little root poking out the top of the soil there, amongst the moss that's on there. And what we do is we deliberately pot them tall as an indoor plant so that that root gets exposed, because it makes a really funky and unusual plant. So you can actually have these as an indoor in your house with over time you can expose more and more of the root as you go up. And you end up with a plant that's got a really interesting flower, and it's edible in 100 different ways. And it also looks just fantastic. They also flower, and the flowers can be eaten as well. Again, you can use them as a cordial substitute as well. So the Currajong is one of our sort of most useful and interesting species. It's worth noting, and I'm going to bring this big guy over for a moment, just bear with me because it's fairly heavy. It's worth noting that Aceriifolius, the plane tree, which is the one that's most commonly used as a street tree around Melbourne, this one does not have an edible root. So look, you can eat the root, but it doesn't form that nice long tuber. So if you're going to do it, you're better off using the other one, and yeah, basically you'll get a better result. Whereas if you use this one, I find personally my preference is the seed from this one and the roots and the shoots from the other one. So kind of worth having both, and they both work well as an indoor plant. You can see here how we're growing this one. It's surrounded by vanilla lilies in a nice big pot on its own. So this in and of itself is a nice little bush food garden, and probably a good example of what you could do in a balcony setting. Or a small space garden, or indeed indoors if that's what you're looking to do. Alright everybody, we're going to wrap things up there. I want to thank everybody for their time today and for your questions. If you've got any other questions, feel free to send us an email or send us a message on Instagram. We're always here and happy to help you. We are open to the public as well, and I want to thank Port Phillip for hosting us as part of this NAIDOC Week talks that we've been doing. They're doing a really excellent little program of interesting ways that anybody can get involved, learn a little bit about the Indigenous history of this area, which is so rich, so diverse, and unfortunately really underrepresented. And if there's anything that anyone ever needs, yeah, get in touch. I should also say that parks are open again. Parks Victoria and all of those groups have reopened them. But we don't want to see people coming in and stripping the plants out of the parks. So I know I've said this a couple of times, but it's really important that as part of learning this knowledge, we acknowledge that it is the knowledge of the Indigenous people, and that those are the foods of those Indigenous people, and that food and culture are really so intertwined. So we really don't want to be going out there and stripping whole areas of the suburbs of the seed, because that is how the plants reproduce. And we don't want to be basically stripping it so that no one else gets to share in it as well. So yeah, that's everything. Thanks very much, everybody.